Good evening, everyone. I'm Deanna Canini, President of the Museum of Newport Irish History, and I welcome all of you out there in our virtual world, both our members and hopefully prospective members, to the fourth lecture of the season. We have an impressive group tonight with over 150 viewers, and I understand from 20 states, across 20 states, and from 2 other countries. I believe this may be a record for us. Our next lecture, that you know, is on March 19th. We'll be back to our hybrid model of in-person at the Wyndham Newport Hotel and also streaming via Zoom. The lecture will be given by Raymond McKenna, titled Old Stone Bank, A Window into the Lives of Our 19th Century Ancestors. And remember, the drawing for the Luck of the Irish raffle will be done at the conclusion of the lecture. So if you haven't bought the lucky ticket yet, please go on our website under events and purchase your lucky ticket. The High Holy Month of March, Irish Heritage Month, is days away. In addition to the lecture, the Interpretive Center will be open the weekends of March 7th, 14th, and 21st. Please come visit us. Also, the trolley tour of Irish Newport with Mike Slane will return on March 16th. Steve Marino will again give a tour of Bonnie Street Cemetery on March 22nd, followed by a tour of St. Mary's Cemetery March 29th. And again, we will close out the month with lots of fun on March 30th with dancing at the 40 steps. You will receive a flyer, so you don't have to take any notes. Receive a flyer in the mail shortly with all the details. To get more information, you can also go, and to register for the events, you can just go to the website, newportirishhistory.org, under the events tab. I also want to report that very soon, we will be launching the new tours of Irish Newport via an app with QR codes that Mike Slane has been working diligently on. It'll be our entrance into the digital world and allowing members and visitors to Newport to experience our rich heritage. Also, we're making amazing progress on the creation of the digital display that I keep reporting on, enlivening one's visit to the museum, scheduled to go live by the season opening in May. And now to the main event. First off, I want to thank Peg Murray, our very, very dedicated secretary of the museum's board, for her generous gift to sponsor this lecture in memory of her husband, Vincent J. Murray. Tonight, all the way from California, is Dr. Scott Spencer, who is an assistant professor of musicology at the University of Southern California's Thornton School of Music. His research includes looking at the intersection of oral tradition and digital technology through the lens of traditional Irish music. His current work is writing a history of the NYPD Emerald Society Bagpipe Band. His presentation this evening will certainly be interesting and fun as we listen to some historical musical recordings in the framework of the last century's traditional Irish music and its impact on the Irish and Irish American identity and community. For your information, as you probably realize now, you'll be muted and will not appear on the video during the lecture. If you do have any questions, and I hope you do, and I'm sure you will, please enter them via the chat function, and they'll be addressed by Dr. Spencer at the end of the lecture. Now I want to welcome Dr. Scott Spencer for his first appearance as a lecturer for us as he presents traditional music and Irish American identity at the dawn of the recording age. Dr. Spencer?
Thank you
Welcome.
so much. It's great to be with you. It's an honor to be here. And thank you to the Murray family, to Deanna, to Anne, and also Anne Arnold, and Dan is in the background working on things as well. Thank you. It takes a team to make these things happen, and I really appreciate it. Also, please make sure to thank your local museum of Irish history. It's the entree into studying the history of culture and the artifacts around it. It's completely impossible to do it without archives and museums. And I'll be referencing a number of images and things like that from the Ward Irish Music Archives in Milwaukee, Wisconsin today. And yes, there will be moments where the audio will not be perfect. I have tried to make sure that everything is balanced out, but there will be moments where it won't be perfect. And partly that's because we'll be playing some of these. Some wax cylinders and 78 RPM records. And as we all know, the audio quality on those is not always so great. So for one frame of reference before we get into the subject material today, we all know as scholars of Irish history and enthusiasts of Irish history and as Irish Americans, there were a number of things that were happening at the turn of the last century. So late 1800s, early 1900s, there are 4 different areas that we're going to think about today that were all colliding, intersecting, and definitely colliding and making collateral damage and eddies and all kinds of chaos and shrapnel at the same time. Those 4 things were this. One is that Irish America was coming out of a moment of popular culture where minstrelsy, blackface minstrelsy and sort of the horrors of that, when we turn back and look at this nowadays, that was being slowly segued out as Tony Pastor, who was an impresario, ran theaters in Union Square, New York City. He literally put up a piece of paper on the wall that said, "These are the words that we can no longer say on stage." And he was brilliant because the reason that he did that was that he knew that his audiences were all male and that they would all be fighting and no women and children would show up. And he decided that he wanted to do matinees. He wanted to expand his audience. And so he cleaned up the acts, and that was the beginning of vaudeville. So we see end of minstrelsy, beginning of vaudeville, and things changing on stages. That's the first trend. The second trend is that Ireland, as we all know, was having a little bit of a moment. The late 1800s, early 1900s was a major Gaelic revival. We also see the beginning, the Easter Rising in 1916, the creation of the Free State in 1922, the Anglo-Irish Treaty in 1921. So this is a moment that things in Ireland are drastically changing. So America's coming out of minstrelsy and vaudeville. Ireland is having a major political upheaval. There's echoes of that in the US. We have the diaspora who had come over post-famine, but also in the intervening waves of migration. We're suddenly thinking, there's so much that's going on back home. How do we keep in touch with this? Newspapers were coming across, news was coming. This is before the days of easy travel and easy information. So news was trickling back, and the diaspora was fascinated with what was going on back in Ireland, but didn't have great access to it. So that was the third thing. This was especially prevalent in Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Providence, up and down the East Coast. The fourth thing is that this is the moment in which recording technology starts. Edison invents or starts mass producing his wax cylinder recorder in 1889, and by 1912 or so, we start seeing wax cylinder recorders being phased out, and 78 RPM records getting phased in and really taking control of the market. So those are the 4 things. We have popular culture in America changing, the Gaelic revival, Easter Rising, political things going on back in Ireland, echoes of that in culture in the US, in the diaspora, and the dawn of the recording age. So the reason that all of this caught my eye when I was starting to study, and I will now throw you some slides, is statements like this. These early 78 RPM records made their way to Ireland and had a profound effect upon the tradition. And I heard so many different variations of this. Reg Hall, in one of his books, said, quote, "I've heard of returned Yanks coming home with a new dress or a new suit, a wind-up gramophone, and a few records, but the story eventually becomes a bit of a myth." Or Kenny Matheson in the book Celtic Music, "The music they recorded in the United States during the 3 decades prior to the 1950s found its way back to Ireland on 78 RPM records and became enormously influential." How do they find their way back? That seems like that gives them agency. Do they have little legs, and do they sprout wings and fly back to Ireland? Tommy Gilmartin said McKenna's discs made a tremendous impact when they filtered back home, which makes me wonder, was that reverse osmosis? Is that osmosis? I don't know. Or Harry Bradshaw, RTE engineer and brilliant scholar, says Coleman's records were sent back to Ireland where they gave players inspiration. Tommy Gilmartin said that the ways that this would happen was sometimes a little bit odd. If they had posted them, sent them through the mail, they would have been broken, which they would have at the time. So if we can think of those four different things and try to figure out, well, how did this actually happen? This is where things start getting fun. So what I'd like to do is show you a couple of things that were happening in popular culture at the time. And if we think about music at the time of the late 1800s, early 1900s, one of the few things that we have pre-recordings is sheet music. And this is interesting because there's not a whole lot of people that would read music, but people in positions of middle class, upper class might have a parlor piano, and maybe on Sundays would invite friends over and they'd sing songs from the parlor piano. And we do have a number of Irish songs, a lot of them that were engaged with politics. Here's 1866. This is from the Ward Irish Music Archives sheet music collection in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. So this is published in New York City, When Fenians Fight for Freedom, by Wood and Tucker. Not necessarily great Irish names, but this was published oftentimes when people would be on stage on the theaters of Broadway and would sing a popular tune. The next day, someone would show up and would be selling penny sheets. So literally a penny for a song sheet that you could bring home, and somebody would be making a buck and you could bring home and do this stuff at home. And we have a lot of really interesting ones from this time period. Some that are really engaging politics. Home Rule for Ireland by Lewis and Erdman, 1914. A couple others that I found. I Had a Dream That Ireland Was Free by Johnstone and Crams, 1917. Some of these would be, in this case, Thomas Egan would have sung this on the stages, and you can see there it says, "Sung with Great Success" by Thomas Egan. And so he would come off the stage and people would file out of the theater and people would be outside saying, "You heard it inside, now you can buy it. 1 penny for I Had a Dream That Ireland Was Free among the nations of the earth." Or, this is gorgeous, "Help Ireland Win Her Cause" by A. Franzini, another great Irish name, 1920. So we have all kinds of things popping up like this. Oh, another one that actually hit popular culture is Little Nellie Kelly from George M. Cohan, 1922. George M. Cohan had a big influence on a lot of the popular culture of the time too. Cohan, plus a lot of the folks in the Brill Building or Tin Pan Alley, you've probably heard that phrase. Tin Pan Alley was where a lot of musicians would be writing songs. That was roughly, 1885 to 1925? Again, kind of erased by recordings, but at the time it was a place where people were just cranking out songs. And usually they were based on stereotypes. So we all know the things, green shamrock shores, leprechauns, comely maidens, green fields, the shamrock, all of these sorts of things. You could take a bunch of those terms, stick them in a shaker, spill them out, and that would be a song. And if it stuck, it stuck. If it didn't, you move on and do another one. And there are some great songs that we still know to this day that came from that era. And I'd love to show a couple of these. This is all just, again, to give a little bit of an idea of the popular culture of the time. This is one that I think that many of us will know. Let's see if I can play this.
That's sweet. Spell it for me, Eddie. H-A-double-R-I-G-H-in proud of all the Irish blood that's in me. Civil a man can say a word again, me. Spell it again, me boy.
H-A-double-R-G-A-N-U-C.
Thank you kindly. It's a name that the shame never has been connected with.
Harrigan.
Aha! That's me. Now this is me.
Well, the great thing about this is that I can hear a number of people singing along with us in the background. I had a friend, Brian Halloran, whose parents used to sing to him and spell it spell Halloran instead. Halloran, that's me. Interestingly, that comes from a stage production. It was premiered in the Garrick Theater in New York City in February 3rd, 1908. And the production was called 50 Miles from Boston. So obviously, this is about Providence, and obviously this is about the Museum of Irish History in Newport. 50 miles almost exactly to the nose. I actually looked at it on a map earlier. So we have popular culture songs like this that are passing through, but they're on the stages, and people pick them up, becomes part of the oral tradition. Maybe there's a song sheet that goes out. To this day, we still hear these songs sort of flitting about sometimes. In this case, this was in a movie as well. This all starts to change in 1889, when Edison starts doing mass production of wax cylinders. But ironically, all the wax cylinders are done one by one by one, rather than stamping out hundreds of them from one performance. One of these, you can actually hear the audience in the background. Yet again, another one of our entree points in popular culture at the time. Oops. And this is where I try to get to the next one, is, let's see, here we go. This is a wax cylinder recording of John McCormick singing Macushla, and this is recorded live March 30th, 1911. John McCormick, of course, was one of the most influential bel canto singers, tenors of the time, recorded hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of songs, toured all over the world, but happened to be there at the moment when recording was suddenly possible. And so was influential partly because he was being recorded. So there's another area that I want to bring in too, because Irish music is not just all songs. And in fact, this was a really important moment for the things that were not songs. This was a very important moment for dance tunes. As the Gaelic revival was hitting back in Ireland, somewhat in opposition to British rule, and people were looking very far to the west of Ireland to find things that were inherently Irish, that were away from continental influence: language, sports, food culture, dress, music, and dance. And there were a number of people that were turning to the fringes, to the Gaeltacht, to the Irish-speaking areas, to try to find what was remaining there. And we have a figure in the US who was doing this as well. And this is a little bit of a topic for another day, but Captain Francis O'Neill, sorry, I think I just missed it there. Here we go. Captain Francis O'Neill was the police chief of Chicago. He rose through the ranks 1873, he signed up with the Chicago Police Force after a full life of adventure, rose up through the ranks and was appointed police chief in 1901 and stayed there till 1905. He was a very stalwart member of the Irish Club of Chicago, Irish Music Club of Chicago. You see him just left of center there. He was an avid flute player, could not read a note of music, and was absolutely entranced by the diaspora, by all the folks that were passing through Chicago, that were playing fiddle tunes, flute tunes. And one of them especially that caught his eye was Patrick Toohey. Patsy Toohey was a brilliant vaudevillian. He had been playing on the stages of New York, Boston, all the way down to Louisiana, all the way out to California, through the continent. He would do a little patter, a little song and dance, was a very skilled dancer, but played the uilleann pipes and played them in a very, very flashy way. And O'Neill caught him a number of times, and with all the other musicians that were passing through Chicago, would stop them and would sit them down and say, "What tunes do you have? I'd like to transcribe those." Of course, O'Neill did not know how to transcribe music, so he would often ask one of his other police sergeants, Sergeant Early, a couple of others, to transcribe music for him. And he published then roughly 7 books of Irish dance tunes. This one is from 1907. He published from 1903 to 1922. Dance Music of Ireland by O'Neill. And this one is from 1907. This is original. It's beautiful. I'm going to be a little delicate with it, but you can see that he transcribed out a lot of these tunes, and many of them he will actually have an acknowledgement of from whom he transcribed. One of the difficulties with this, of course, is that this is time for a story. This is a little bit of a tangent, but an ethnomusicologist walks into a bar in Ireland and is looking for tunes. And there's an old fiddle player, half blind, half drunk, and he's playing a tune, and the ethnomusicologist stops and says, "I've never heard that tune before. Can I write that down?" And the fiddle player says, "Sure, if you decorate the mahogany." And the ethnomusicologist is like, "What does that mean, decorate the mahogany? I don't understand." And the guy gestures and he says, "Oh, buy a round of drinks. I'll buy a round of drinks." Buys a round of drinks and plays the tune. And the guy is transcribing feverishly, trying to get all the notes down, getting the notes down. And then he realizes, I think I didn't quite get it. Could you play that one more time? And the fiddle player says, "Sure, if you decorate the mahogany." And the guy's right, round of drinks, buys a round of drinks, goes back, and the fiddle player plays it again, and he's desperately copying down the notes, and he says, "I think I got most of it, but that second part, I don't have, could you do the second part again?" And he says, "Sure, if you," another round of drinks. Third time around, he's doing corrections, and he realizes the fiddle player never plays the tune the same way twice. This is part of the oral tradition. This is part of traditional Irish music. And in fact, when Patsy Toohey had done some of the tunes for O'Neill, and O'Neill transcribed them out, he had to shorten them, take out some of the variations, and try to find an ur-text, like a one thing that could be that tune. Unfortunately, it's not that easy with traditional Irish music, and I'll show you here, trying to transcribe out one of those tunes that fit into 2 lines. When Mitchell and Small did that and tried to transcribe the whole recording of Patsy Toohey out, it took 2 actual pages to get the whole thing right. So that's a topic of another day. But the recording process to do wax cylinders, and I can show you a little bit here, was difficult. Patsy Toohey, we'll come back to him in a moment here. Here is a picture of a recording studio, And you can see that there's a horn that the tenor is singing into. There are a whole bunch of brass instruments. Interestingly, a number of those are violins. You can see the bows. There are Stroh violins, S-T-R-O-H violins, which have a brass horn to guide the sound towards the horn. And this is, again, to cut into wax. And even to this day, when jazz players will talk about doing a recording, they'll talk about cutting a recording. That cuts really well. And that was exactly this. It was groups that would get together and would play for the horn. There were no such thing as microphones at that point. Edison was in the process of inventing such things, but they weren't quite available yet. They would shout into the horn. It would transfer to a diaphragm with a needle on the end that would then cut into the wax. That meant that if tenor Jacques Urlis here was singing, it was contracted to do 100 copies, that means he had to sing it 100 times. And eventually, you know, things became a little bit easier to do multiple cylinders at the same time, but only until we get to flat recordings, records, can you actually stamp them out, and you can do mass production that way. Or this, which is a wax cylinder playing into a wax cylinder recording, but you can only imagine how the sound on that would probably not go so well. So, Patsy Toohey shows up in Chicago. He most likely at one of the World's Fairs in Chicago is exposed to the Edison wax cylinder, and he sees an opportunity here. A little bit later, O'Neill writes back, and I'll share this again. O'Neill writes back to Ireland, Toohey could not get enough for his time from the record people. His theatrical business is more profitable. They found a cheaper man, James C. McAuliffe, and cheaper work, of course. This is one of the early companies that reached out to performers, especially people that were known on the stages of New York, Boston, etc. Most of the recording technology was in New York or in Brunswick, New Jersey. Edison's company, the state park is still there. This is the machine that these things would have been sold, that would have been for private recording. So I believe it was Victor Records comes to Patsy Toohey and says, we would like you to record for our company. And Patsy Toohey inquires, well, how much would that be? And the figure isn't as much as he would like. In fact, he realizes that he could make more money just by going and playing on stage. So he says no, but he keeps it in the back of his head and returns to the idea later. He buys a wax cylinder recorder, like the one we just saw, and he puts an advertisement into the newspaper. And I have a copy of that here that I found in one of my last trips to New York. I'm very excited about this one. Irish World, New York, the newspaper, he puts an advertisement on the 18th of May in 1901, Irish bagpipes on the phonograph. Original phonograph records of the Irish piper made to order by the best Irish piper in America. $1 each, $10 per dozen. Send for catalog of 150 Irish airs, jigs, reels, hornpipes, etc. to Patsy Toohey, 1388 Bristow Street, New York City. And this is the beginning of something much more interesting and much more important. The record labels are, of course, recording commercially, but they're not necessarily giving musicians the best deal. And Patsy Toohey realizes that this is something that he could do himself. And here are a bunch of wax cylinder recordings from him. This is now how we can actually go in and check O'Neill, because O'Neill eventually purchased a wax cylinder recorder and was able to do recordings in his own parlor. Many of these, when O'Neill's son, Rogers, dies tragically at a very young age, O'Neill swears off recordings, music in the house, and sends all of these to the fire chief, the fire captain Dunn in Milwaukee, the next big town north. And these go missing for a number of years, but were found about 15 years ago. And Barry Stapleton, the head of the Warda Irish Music Archives, brought these in and has digitized them. And we now have a collection of wax cylinders by Patsy Toohey that were saved, in fact, by this gentleman. Many of them were saved by Tom Busby in Long Island, and a couple of other enthusiasts that saved these wax cylinders, put them onto reel-to-reel or cassette tapes, and there's now a pretty definitive collection, many of which were transcribed by Mitchell and Small for the piping of Patsy Toohey, yet we can actually go back and listen to them. So now we can hear the original as played versus O'Neill's transcription of them, which is kind of fascinating. But this is a bit of a tangent. What I'd love to do here is to instead go into how these things moved around. And we can turn back again to Captain Francis O'Neill, who we have some of his letters still. And he says, as a Christmas present which was sure to be appreciated, I forward in 1907 to Reverend Dr. Hennebury in Waterford, Ireland, a box of Edison phonograph records. We know that they arrived safely. This is another box that he sent in 1911. So we know that they have been moving around and that Captain Francis O'Neill has been sending them. Your consignment of Toohey tunes were shipped just a week ago via United States Express prepaid. Patsy announced the names of himself, so you have a record of his voice as well. They were made in Sergeant Early's residence, and now they are yours, and I wish you luck with them. This is basically the beginning of an exchange system that the record companies hadn't even set up yet. This was sending phonographs, wax cylinders, to Ireland. Here is the Dunn collection. These are a number of wax cylinders, mostly of Patsy Toohey, but others that O'Neill was working with in Chicago. And we have access to these now. There's the Shaskeen Reel, played by Patsy Toohey. O'Neill writes, and this is how we get to segue into 78 RPM records. Captain Francis O'Neill in Chicago, at the epicenter of traditional Irish music, as he's publishing all of these books of tunes, says, yours came to hand less than 2 weeks ago. I could not find a Victor or Columbia phonograph among my friends, as they all had the Edison cylinder machine, so I was obliged to go to Lyon and Healy Music House to test them this very day. This is funny to me because he had been sending wax cylinders to Ireland, assuming that he was at the absolute epicenter of recording technology, and somebody in Ireland sends him something else back, and he doesn't have the technology for it. So once again, Ireland was slightly ahead of the game, even for Chicago. So this brings us, though, into this idea of other kinds of recording. Wax cylinder is great. It's not long-lived, it's not mass-producible, and it's not easily sent because it's wax. So the recording companies, by 1912, 78 RPM records really were becoming king. They kind of took over wax cylinders, even though wax cylinders, you could actually record on them at home, so that was its own thing, but the mass production was driving down the costs. Here are some Victor Victrolas. I actually even have with me a portable 78 RPM record player that I would play you things on, but the sound is pretty bad and it dies very quickly. But we have access to some of these things. So one of the things that was fascinating about this moment is that this is where the money was. The actual consoles themselves. And I'm sure that many of you have old Victrola players still kicking around at home. I have my grandparents, and they're gorgeous. Mahogany, oak, beautiful inlay. They're really set up to replace the parlor piano. So having a parlor piano was a sign of being wealthy, and maybe having kids that had been trained in music that could perform. So this was a great substitute for a parlor piano. You didn't need musical training, and you could have the best. You could have Caruso, you could have John McCormick in your living room singing to you. And one of the interesting things with this, of course, is that the companies that were selling these realized very early that the money was in the cabinets and not necessarily the records themselves. So many of these companies would try to sell you the record cabinet, and they would do that by the loss leader of the 78 RPM record. So and some of the earliest 78 RPM records that were not classical music or popular music were Egyptian or Indian or Irish. This is Swallowtail and Green Fields of America by Patrick Scanlon on Columbia Records. So if somebody was to be given a Columbia record with Irish music on it, and they were from the Irish music community, what would that person do? You would give it to the pillar of the community. They would then have to go and buy a Victrola. That's where the money was. And it was very kind of insidious, insipid. It was a way of sneaking into ethnic communities and expanding the market for these cabinets by making records that were from those communities. It was a great point of pride to be able to play Egyptian music if you're the pillar of the Egyptian community in New York. But to get back into some more slides here, the first person to really do this, Irish American in New York City, this is Ellen O'Byrne DeWitt. And there's a great story with her. So Ellen O'Byrne DeWitt comes over from Ireland. Her husband is, I believe, from the Netherlands. They arrive in New York City. They're married once they are in New York. She pushes really hard to start up a nostalgia store of Irish goods. And she wants to call it by her name. But at that point, companies really had to be in the husband's names. So she ended up naming it the O'Byrne DeWitt store. And this was mostly Irish lace. It was tea. It was nostalgic stuff from back home in Ireland. And oftentimes when she knew people were coming back on the steamships, she would ask them to bring a few extra things with them. So very early on, she started selling wax cylinders from the store. And her son, Justice, her husband, Justice DeWitt, they had 5 kids, I believe. Justice Jr. was brought into the business as well. And apparently what was happening, and this is from some interviews with Mick Maloney, Fletcher Fisher is on this call right now, and Fletcher is working on a documentary of Mick Maloney, which I'm very much looking forward to. But his interviews were also accessed by Maeve Nuurchan, who is a professor of Irish music and archaeology and etc. in University of Galway. And her work on this is stunning. Ellen O'Byrne DeWitt, with $100 to her name, opens up this store and immediately starts working the neighborhood. And she's working the Irish American neighborhood. What is it that you want? I will get it, I'll sell it to you. What is it that you're looking for from back home? And this is early 1900s. So there's a Gaelic revival back home. We're about to hit 1916, the Easter Uprising. All the diaspora has their eyes back on Ireland. And they're trying to figure out how they can be a part of things. So Ellen O'Byrne DeWitt starts selling records. And of course, we have the nostalgic songs, but she says there are people that keep coming in wanting to dance. They want to have a ceilidh in their kitchen. They want to move all the tables and chairs out of the way and dance. And if they can't get Michael Coleman or Paddy Killoran, they want to play records of dance music. So she sends her son Justice out to Long Island, to Celtic Park, and says, "Find me some musicians." Meanwhile, she goes to Columbia Records and says, "If I can get some musicians doing Irish stuff, will you record them?" And they say, "Well, yes, if you guarantee that you'll buy 500 records." She says, "Absolutely, no problem." She starts working the community. Justice, meanwhile, goes out to Long Island, and here is Mick Maloney's interview. This is on an incredible RTE documentary. Here's Mick Maloney's interview with Justice DeWitt, the son of Ellen O'Byrne DeWitt, in which he describes his adventure out to Long Island.
The very first side that Herborn and Wheeler put down for Ellen was the mouse in the cupboard. It's reported she went door to door.
Oops.
And they were entertaining, and they had a hat on the ground or something for anybody to chip in a dime or a quarter or whatever, and they'd stand there and listen to them. Well, the best of the bunch that I heard was these two fellows, Herborn and Wheeler, and we brought them back to, I spoke to them, gave them my address and asked them to come over and see us, and we took them down to Columbia, and Columbia recorded them on the proposition that we'd buy so many hundred of each record that we would recommend, which we did.
So they record, they make 500 copies. It's sold out within 2 days. And they go back a couple of days later, and in fact, that was recorded December 18th, 1916. And by January 9th, they're back in the studio of Columbia saying, "Can we record another 500? And Herborn and Wheeler end up recording a number of different sides for Columbia that are an exclusive for Ellen O'Byrne DeWitt, including The Mouse in the Cupboard, recorded December 18th, 1916, The Stack of Barley, Herborn and Wheeler, January 9th, 1917. We can even hear what this sounds like. It's a good idea. Again, sorry, the recording quality is not great, but Ellen O'Byrne DeWitt then says, "We will sell this." And this becomes a staple of, she shifts a little bit her store into doing graphenolas, Victrolas, Sonoras. She renames the company Sinn Féin, the Sinn Féin Records. She renames it later to Ellen O'Byrne DeWitt, to E. O'Byrne DeWitt and Son, to, when she dies in 1926, to E. O'Byrne DeWitt's son, where Justice Jr. takes on, and then ends up doing a number of different versions of things, including starts up his own Copley label, which we probably all have seen. So the early Herborn and Wheeler, for specifically just for dancing, morphs into Flanagan Brothers, and Dan Neely is doing an incredible bunch of research on the Flanagan Brothers at this point. Frank Quinn, Murty Rabbit and his Gaelic band. Victor Talking Machine World pounces on this. The Edison Records is kind of phasing out, but Victor, Columbia, Brunswick, a bunch of others. Ellen O'Byrne DeWitt dies in 1926, and immediately we're seeing things in Victor Talking Machine World, the flyer for all the affiliates that are selling across the US. Few people are more interested in music and entertainment than those hardy foreign-born Americans who constitute so large a portion of the population of the average town or city, and though they may live thriftily in many ways, music plays an important part in their lives, and they spend annually large sums of money for this entertainment. Ordinary sales methods do not always reach this class of population. They group together and keep to their own language. Their purchasing of an article is oftentimes stimulated by the experience of friends. And we can see that 25 new dealers now carry the complete Irish collection, 1926. We see advertisements all across the East Coast about graffanolas, 1925, genuine Victrolas, Gannett Records on sale with a full Irish supply. Patsy Toohey comes back and finally records. There's so many different labels: Celtic, Brunswick, I'll Take You Home Again, Kathleen, Lyric Records, phonographs, Irish Records, the Monarch Phonograph Company. It just goes on and on and on. However, one of the most fascinating things in all of this to me is that the people who were recorded, Michael Coleman and Paddy Killorn, both had come from County Sligo at pretty much the exact same time. They hadn't met each other in Ireland, but when they arrived in New York, this was the moment when everybody was clamoring for dances, because in 1916-ish, people in the diaspora were just desperate for news back home, and they were trying to do a Gaelic revival here in New York. Paddy Killorn, Michael Coleman were the two in most demand, and because they were on the stages and because they were in New York, they were asked to record, and their recordings have become the absolute quintessential Irish music recordings at the height of the golden age of recording. Interestingly, they both had students, Andy McGann and Patty Reynolds, who then continued on their traditions in New York City, took on students as well. Brian Conway, Tony DeMarco, both of whom to this day, Tony was just playing in the 11th Street Bar last night in New York City. And Brian Conway, retired assistant district attorney of New York City, his star student, Patrick Mangan, went on to play with Riverdance. And I would love to play you one of his tunes in which he references this tradition too. Let me bring this up. And here's Patrick Mangan, who is going to walk us through the reason that he plays music, the heritage that goes back to these early recordings, and how that is still absolutely entrenched in the playing of New York, Boston, Providence, everywhere.
So, as I said, I am from New York, and I wanted to showcase a bit about what that means to me, which is this New York Sligo style of fiddle playing that goes back to Michael Coleman, who really popularized the style far and wide on his recordings that he made when he immigrated to New York, and many others, including Paddy Killorn. Those guys would have passed it on to the likes of Andy McGann, Paddy Reynolds, who I was very, very fortunate to kind of be mentored by when I was growing up. And then again, that was passed on to the next generation of fiddle players like Brian Conway, who I studied with for many years, Tony DeMarco, who's also been a great mentor over the years, you know, playing with him in sessions and stuff like that. So it was really hard for me to decide on what tune to play for this. But I got thinking about Coleman and this lineage of playing, and I thought, why not play In Memory of Coleman, composed by the great Ed Reevy. And I couldn't just play one Ed Reevy tune. I had to tag another one of my favorites onto there, another one of his great compositions, Maudubon Chapel. So I'm going to play those two reels for you now, In Memory of Coleman and Maudubon Chapel by Ed Reevy. Ed famously said that, you know, he's just happy that his tunes are out there in the world, and everyone has their own story to tell and puts their own spin on them. They're so open to variation and interpretation, and he seemed to be happy enough with that, that people play them faithfully enough but put their own spin on them. So I hope you enjoy this. Thanks a lot.
I'm so sorry to stop that beautiful music. What I will do is I will put a link to it in the chat, and will also encourage you to start writing in questions. The moral of this whole story is that when we come back to this opening question, this opening quote, the one that I kept running into, these early recordings were coming into Ireland from the States, and the musicians who were making those recordings were becoming influential because they were making recordings. No one had made them before. This, to me, is the quintessential part of this whole thing. We had so much foment going on with coming out of one style of popular culture and changing to something else. Gaelic revival going on back in Ireland with massive political upheaval, the diaspora trying to connect somehow to that upheaval, and the creation of the recording industry all happening at the same time. These tunes, these records, influenced so deeply that Sligo style became very quintessential in Ireland because of Coleman and Killorn's playing. If you go to a session these days, any session in the world, you'll hear a lot of these tunes because they were the ones that were recorded. So that's just a quick glimpse into the dawn of the recording age, Irish American identity, and music. And I want to thank you all, and we'll turn it back to Deanna to sum things up here.
Thank you so much, Scott. And it was fun. It really was fun hearing, and we all know how important music has been in our lives, to many of us as we were growing up. I have to say, when I was in grammar school, I performed HARRIGAN as the you had to show and tell. That was my show and tell, probably in third grade, and I did have a Victrola. Anyway, so we have any questions, please put them in chat. I think we should probably ask you to come visit us, and maybe we can add a whole music section. We have a section called play, but we don't have a lot of our music, so maybe we should have you come and advise us on how to add music to our little museum. So.
Well, there's such an incredible tradition of music that's out in that area too. I mean, with the maritime traditions, with all the different populations that have been passing through, and with the major Irish presence that has been in Providence and around too. It's begging for it, and it would be really fun. I'm sure it would sort of sneak into the rest of the history as well.
And we're very fortunate. We have some centers here. We have a session every week at Fastnet Pub. We're very fortunate. We have the opportunity to enjoy music, every week. And then, as you said, and I say earlier, we celebrate dancing at the 40 steps. As I mentioned, you're not aware of what it is, but it's where many of the individuals from Irish descent worked in the estates, and they would come on Sunday afternoons to dance and to court and to play. They play music, and it's a section on the Cliff Walk right on the ocean, and it's quite famous. We reenact that every year.
Oh, that's lovely. Well,
Yeah.
And Deanna, I'm sorry to interrupt you there. One of the things that I find so important about this is that in Ireland, you were from County Clare or County Galway, or you were from a particular parish. But as soon as you got to the US, as soon as you made it to America, then you were Irish, and everybody had to kind of clump together. And even if you were from different counties, it was in reaction to, the dominant American forces. And so we all had to kind of clump together. And actually, there's a great thing in the side here. John Murphy writes, Sligo style, very nostalgic. My grandparents, Mike and Annie Behan, hailed from the far west in Ayr. My mother always played the Irish Washerwoman as the first tune when she sat down at the piano. So yeah, that it puts into perspective how important this stuff was for people that were first, second generation. If you don't mind, Deanna, there's another question that I just got forwarded here. Tim May asks, Have you ever heard of or used the website thesession.org? It's an amazing resource of information about Irish music and scholars from all over the world who contribute to the website. I will encourage everyone to take a look at that if you're interested in the music. It's literally www.thesession.org. And it's a great resource in a multitude of ways. Oftentimes, anytime somebody plays a tune, there's a story behind it, how they learned it, where they got it from, where it's been recorded. And that has always been part of the oral tradition of, if you go to a session, an Irish session at a pub, and there's some old timer that's there, generally the younger players are pumping that person for information. They'll finish it playing a tune, and the younger players will say, "What's the name of that? Where did you get that? I heard you playing it this way. Is that a different way? Is that a variation? Where is that recorded?" And the old timers will almost always have all of that information. The younger players have been starting to write that down because they realize that the oral tradition can vanish. And so the session.org has been a great place for people documenting some of this oral tradition and putting it onto a website so that it's accessible and it is available for those who are coming in a later generation trying to pick up this oral tradition. This, of course, is the moment where I say, make sure to go thank your local Museum of Irish History, because that is literally what museums and archives are doing, is that they're becoming repositories of information so that the next generation can still have access to it.
And, well, thank you. Thank you so much. And please, if any questions you think of later, just email us at newportirishhistory@gmail.com, and we'll forward them to Scott. And remember our lecture on the 19th, and also the Luck of the Irish raffle. And you can always register for everything online. And to our non-member listeners, please consider becoming a member to support all these great offerings and lectures and the mission of the museum. So if there's nothing else, I think we have a few more minutes. Is there any other questions out there? Do we have someone? Anything else there, Scott? Do you see?
I have nothing coming in on this end. Just a couple of thank yous and congratulations. Actually, the person from France has a meeting in the morning, and it's, I think, 2 a.m. there right now, and passed on a thank you. But I did want to thank all of you. Mike O'Malley just said thank you. Mike O'Malley is, I believe this is the author of biography of Captain Francis O'Neill. He says, yes, it's me. So if you get a chance, Mike O'Malley's biography of Captain Francis O'Neill, how do we say? Pulls no punches. And I want to thank you, Deanna Conheeney. I want to thank Anna Arnold and Dan, who's been in the background working on all the technology stuff and tries to be thankless, but I'll thank him anyway. It has been a true pleasure speaking with you all, and I'm honored to be a part of this, and delighted to be part of an institution that's carrying on traditions in such a way.
Thank you so much, and please visit us.
Absolutely, I will be there.
We will welcome you.
Thank you so much.
All right. Good night to all. I think we made it.
Great.